Chapter 31. Evidence of a murdered assassin. The man nicknamed after the fictional Vietnam War hero gazed around the office of the woman who was supposed to have been eliminated several hours earlier. It was an impressive-looking office which told Rambo that the private investigator known as Shade Non-So was equipped with a unique eye for detail. Having left the air conditioning unit running, it was clear she had left in a hurry. Since receiving the last text message from the quiet man, there was still no word from the hired assassin. Rambo was not surprised. The second part of the message was already a dead giveaway. The term "go slow" to describe a potential obstacle to what the assassin had been required to do could never have come from a man whose surgical precision and unquestionable efficiency were legendary. Scanning the room, Rambo noticed the severely damaged glass-framed wall sign. Walking over to the sign, he spotted several pieces of shattered glass next to what he suspected were faded bloodstains. Glancing around the room some more, he made his way over to the kitchen and discovered the smoking gun. A mop stuck in a bucket half filled with bloody water. Evidence of a murdered assassin. Sounded strange, like a massive contradiction of terms, but what he had suspected all along, an organized hit gone drastically wrong. But that wasn't all. The quiet man's demise was unlikely to have come at the hands of the woman he was hired to eliminate. Whoever was responsible, it was he and not the quiet man Rambo had been in contact with. However, none of that mattered anymore. The assassin was history, and the only thing left of any consequence was the money at stake, and how, in the absence of a photographed corpse, he was going to get it. He gave it a moment's thought. If the goalposts had to be moved to achieve his objective, then so be it. He would call Juku, tell him the woman was dead, but insist that the evidence would only follow after payment had been made. In the event Juku refused his request, he decided he would remind him of the circumstances that had led to their initial meeting. How important it was that the blood the ex-governor's son already had on his hands remained a secret. Confident of the effectiveness of this plan, Juku's face split into a broad smile. Pulling out his phone, he selected Juku's number. Chapter 32. Michael. Deja vu. Jonah quickly untied me. Looking at him, I could tell his efforts to find me had come at a price. A terribly high price. The damage to his face was significant. A reopened scar beneath his right eye, a swollen bottom lip with a wide split down the middle, some swelling at the back of his head. He looked tired. Dead tired. Knowing Jonah, that was just his body, not his spirit. The look in his eyes told me that even if there were 100 more Emenikes in his way, there still would have been no compromise and no retreat, not until victory was his. I glanced over at the handbag lying on the floor by the wall. "We have to take that with us," I said. "Whose is it?" he replied. "Some girl buried in the garden. Looks like they killed her for the same reason they were about to kill me." I attempted to rise from the chair and screamed in agony. "Need to wait a while," Jonah said, referring to the muscles in my legs which hadn't been used for the last 24 hours. "Get the blood flowing again." I nodded, glanced in the direction of the open door, and spotted Juku's body. "Should have saved them for me," I said bitterly. "Didn't get the pleasure either," Jonah replied, his focus fixed on the body. He broke his neck on the way down the stairs. A mobile device vibrated in one of Juku's pockets. Jonah strolled out of the door, crouched down beside the body and pulled his smartphone from the right pocket of Juku's jeans. He gazed at the screen for a moment and straightened up. Then he strolled back over and extended the handset to me. "Time to give this bastard a piece of your mind," he said. I took the phone, flashing up on the screen a pair of capitalized initials, RB. It was obvious what they stood for. I answered the phone, punched the speaker icon, and the sound of Rambo's voice filled the room. "The woman is dead," he said. I paused for a moment. "You sure about that?" There was another silence on the other end. I pictured Balogun standing there, a shell-shocked expression on his face. "Michael," he said. "Deja vu," I replied. There was another pause. His breathing quickened. "Where's Simon?" I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. "You're a dead man, Balogun," I said, and punched out. Jonah and I traded a look. The expression on his face didn't tell me a great deal, but I figured he was probably sorry he had tried to dissuade me, or maybe, like myself, he was simply appalled that the death of Mr. and Mrs. Echo had turned out to be as close to a murder as one could get. Trouble was, with Jonah, you could never really tell. But then there was one thing of which I had no doubt. We were finally in agreement. "Finish it," I said. Chapter 33. Jonah. Back to Cool Breeze. Taking another look at the blood-stained pliers used in Michael's torture, the magnitude of the punishment he had been forced to endure became all too clear. A horrendous display of cruelty which gave your average Joe no more than a snowball's chance in hell of not spilling the beans. "Finish it," Michael had said to me. But I was already decided. Rambo was done. I just had to find him. And one thing was for certain, I didn't need 12 hours to do it. I waited a few minutes before helping Michael up the treacherous staircase. Leaning on my shoulder, he was holding an old plastic carrier bag, in it a Louis Vuitton handbag. He said the bag belonged to a dead woman. The woman I suspected was the same person Sade's contact had been worried about. "The least we can do is return the item to the family," Michael said. After reaching the top of the staircase, we made our way back through the dark corridor, past Emenike's blood-soaked corpse, and headed out of the front door. Once outside, I noticed the 3 men I had laid out earlier were nowhere to be seen. After the sound of mind-numbing violence that had echoed from the house, I wasn't surprised. Walking at a snail's pace to accommodate Michael's physical limitations, it took us twice as long to get back to the restaurant, which allowed me time to fill him in on the last 8 hours. Information which included a brief rundown on how I'd located Moonlight Investigations, the execution of a hired hitman, and my decision to bring Sade along for the ride. After close to an hour, we shuffled into Mama Tasty. Sade, who was still seated in the same spot, sprang to her feet and threw herself into Michael's arms. They held each other in silence. Neither person said a thing, like the reunion of a couple previously separated by war. I gave them a moment, walked over to the counter, and beckoned to the plump woman who had served us earlier. She stared at my battered face and glanced over at the tearful reunion. "Is everything okay?" "Perfect," I said. "A bottle of Guinness, if you don't mind." "Big one, Abby?" I nodded. She shot off into the kitchen, returned with my favourite beverage, and popped it open. "Thanks." I took a long swig. Michael and the woman I suspected was likely to become his new partner came to join me. "You did it," Sade said, a broad smile on her face. I looked at Michael. "You need a hospital," I said. He nodded and gave me a once-over himself. "I'm not the only one," he said. I returned the nod, drained my bottle, and rose to my feet. There's only one thing I need right now, I said. The next flight back. A few hours later, I boarded the last flight to Lagos. With a return ticket in hand, I caught an Aero Contractors plane with less than 20 passengers on board. 50 minutes later, I arrived in Lagos. I grabbed a cab and headed back to Comfort Hotel. Stomping back through the lobby, I met Tunde. He dashed out from the bar. "Oga," he said, staring at my damaged face in disbelief. "What happened?" I ignored the question. "Can you get me a taxi?" I said. "Of course," he replied. "Where to?" "Back to Cool Breeze." Chapter 34. Jonah. Bastard with no conscience. Following a hot shower and a fresh change of clothes, I grabbed a taxi and headed for Cool Breeze. If there was any chance of finding Rambo, the first place I'd ever set eyes on him was the most logical place to start. After the rumbling in the jungle with Eminike and the surprise topple from what felt like Mount Everest with Juku, I was hurt, severely hurt, but still pumped with the one thing I could depend on to get me to the finishing line, pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The night was far from young, yet the streets were alive, with drivers honking their horns, motorbike riders weaving perilously through traffic, and bus conductors hanging from doors of moving vehicles like Hollywood stuntmen. Lagos at night. Fascinating, but for the next few hours, the least of my concerns. After a 20-minute drive, the taxi arrived at Cool Breeze and cruised into a courtyard, streaming with a crowd of people who, in the words of Prince, were partying like it was 1999. Climbing out of the vehicle, I turned to the driver. "How much do I owe you?" "Oga, don't worry. Your boy has already paid me," he said, referring to Tunde. "I will wait for you." I nodded in appreciation. "Thanks," I said. Turning back, I was intrigued to be confronted with an atmosphere that was a million miles removed from my initial visit to the establishment. The deafening sound of fella singing International Teef Teef echoed from a pair of giant speakers outside the bar. A flood of scantily clad working girls, lit cigarettes held between their fingers and bottles of beer in their hands, moved their bodies like visceral instruments of seduction to the lyrics of Afrobeat's greatest star. And then there were the men, young and old, men out to be serviced for the night, a bunch of them hovering around a barbecue stand, women clinging to their arms as they paid for giant slabs of tasty-looking grilled beef on sticks. Walking into the establishment, a mirror image of what I'd seen outside presented itself in the bar. There was also the strong smell of tobacco combined with the sweet, pungent odor of cannabis. As I made my way through the crowd, I could still hear fella's voice echoing from outside. "I no be thief," the Afrobeat king wailed, followed by the chorus, "You be thief. I no be robber, you be robber." Lyrics, which from the curious stares aimed in my direction, appeared to be directed at me. I stopped abruptly. Like Arnie trying to track down a young John Connor, I scanned the faces in the room. A working girl in her early 30s waltzed up to me. "Fine man," she said. "How far now?" I looked at her. For a moment I thought she hadn't taken a proper look at my battered face before using an adjective like fine to describe what was standing before her. But on second thoughts I figured she was merely plying for business. Flattery, I imagined, was a big part of the deal. "Where's Fumi?" I said. "You don't like me. Where is she?" I repeated. She turned up her nose as though she had just been insulted. "She's with a customer," she snapped and walked off. I snaked my way through the crowd and turned off into the corridor which led to the rented rooms. Whoever she was with would just have to take a hike, I decided. I opened Fumi's door and let myself in. Fumi was seated on the edge of the bed. She was naked. Naked, but alone. Sobbing quietly, she had her head hung over and didn't look up at me as I walked in and took a seat beside her. I took her by the chin, turned up her face, and saw that her right eye was the size of a golf ball. "What happened?" I asked. She turned away. "It was Rambo," she said. "He left a short while ago." "He beat you?" She nodded feverishly. "He was very annoyed when he got here," she said. "I don't know why. After we finished, he refused to pay." "What did he say?" "He said that if I want my money, I must come to his house." "And you refused?" "Yes, I refused. And I told him he was a bastard with no conscience." "That's why he beat you?" "Yes." I took her by the arm and helped her to her feet. "You know where he lives?" "Yes, I've been there before." "Well, you're going to go there again," I said. She looked at me and noticed my injuries. "Jonah," she gasped, placing a soft hand to my cheek. "What happened to—" I didn't let her finish. "Long story," I replied. She nodded to suggest she understood. "He's dangerous," she said. "So am I. Get dressed." I turned away as she got ready and walked over to the door. 2 minutes later, I heard my name. "Jonah?" I spun around and looked at her. Despite the swollen eye, she looked ravishing in a baby doll dress. "I appreciate everything you've done for me," she said. "You are a good man. Let the bastard keep the money. There is no reason to fight with him." "It's personal," I said quietly. She nodded and reached for something on the bed. "Then you might need this." She handed me a bulletproof vest. "It belongs to Rambo," she said. The idiot was so angry he forgot to put it back on before he left. Chapter 35. Bullet from a barrel. On the third floor of a 6-story residential building, the troubled law enforcement officer stumbled into his flat and snapped on the light. Rambo's living room was sparsely furnished, but exceptionally clean. There was no sign of a television or radio, only a glossy hardwood floor, a handsome leather couch, and a well-polished drinks cabinet, making it evident Rambo deemed it essential for his home to remain in pristine condition. The cabinet was loaded with several bottles of hard liquor, but there was only a single brandy glass on display. Rambo had never been one for company. Another item in the room summed up the police officer's personality with even greater accuracy. A wall-mounted painting of Balogun in his police uniform, a portrait in which he was wielding an AK-47 shotgun and standing over the bloodied bodies of a pile of armed robbers. Vivid evidence of a deluded man who lived to manipulate, manufacture, and control every facet of his existence. A deluded man who, for the first time in recent memory, felt threatened, severely threatened. Unbuttoning his tunic, Rambo ran his fingers over the front of his chest. He sunk his head into his palms and took a deep breath. He instantly remembered where he had forgotten his armor of protection and was shocked how quickly he was beginning to lose focus. Since the elimination of the Quiet Man and now Juku, the strain of the last few hours was beginning to take its toll. This man, whoever he might be, was officially a clear and present danger, a lethal weapon who had to be exceptionally skilled to have eliminated not just an incredibly efficient assassin and the son of an ex-governor, but also the ferocious bodyguard known as Eminike. "You're a dead man, Balogun," Michael had said to him on the phone. "You're a dead man," announced with all the confidence of a person who had enough faith in this agent of death to believe it was a foregone conclusion. Rambo pondered his initial response to the pressure. He had headed off to Cool Breeze in the hope that a fierce round of rough sex would ease the tension, and it did, until the insult. His favourite call girl had paid dearly for that. A bastard with no conscience, Fumilayo had called him, a blatant insult from a commoner, Shawo. He opened the cabinet, twisted open a bottle of Jack Daniels, and took a long swig. The liquor burnt his throat and hit the familiar spot, sending an immediate surge of confidence racing through his veins. Withdrawing his service pistol from its holster, he quickly examined the chamber. The gun was a Beretta M9 and had a full clip loaded with 15 bullets. After killing 3 men within 24 hours, this man was probably on his way to do the same to him. But there were 2 sides to every story. Rambo had never met a threat like the one he was faced with. However, he was confident this individual was unlikely to have ever met a force of destruction like himself. Besides, it didn't matter how tough, powerful, or efficient you were, there wasn't a man alive who was tougher than a bullet from a barrel. The barrel of a 9mm. His head snapped around in a response to a knock at the door, and lowering himself to the floor, crept up to the window, pistol at the ready. He cautiously parted the curtains. Fumilayo was standing outside. He rose to his feet and opened the door. "What are you doing here?" he said. "I'm sorry if I offended you earlier," she replied. "I just needed the money. My rent is due." He looked at her, a suspicious expression on his face. He stepped towards her, stuck his head out of the door. Satisfied she was alone, he said, "Come inside." She entered the flat, and he closed the door behind her. Rambo stared at her face as she stood in the room. He couldn't remember causing so much damage to her eye. He found the swelling somewhat off-putting. His gaze switched to her voluptuous figure, and he felt a hardening between his legs. "Remove your clothes," he ordered. Fumilayo unzipped her dress in silence. Rambo holstered his weapon and disappeared into the bedroom. Sitting on the edge of a double bed, he was reaching for the laces of his boots when a familiar sound caught his attention. The sound of the front door being eased open. Whipping out his gun, Rambo dashed back into the living room. Fumilayo was standing by the door, a mobile phone in her hand. "What are you doing?" Rambo yelled, leveling the weapon at her. "Nothing," she cried, backing away in terror. Rambo's eyes turned to the door. Creaking open like the arrival of the proverbial thief in the night, Rambo aimed the gun in its direction, good and ready for whoever was on the other side. Then Fumilayo let out a scream. "Jonah!" The door crashed open, and a towering figure came charging into the room. Rambo pulled the trigger. With a resounding bang, the bullet exploded from the barrel of the 9mm and blasted the intruder back through the door. A brief silence was followed by screams of panic from the street outside. Rambo swallowed a satisfied lump in his throat and smiled. Finally, it was over, he thought. Over and done with. Chapter 36. Game over. Jonah. I had on a bulletproof vest when I was hit by the shot. A dramatic turn of events for a situation which, up until this point, had seemed well in hand. 20 minutes earlier, Fumi and I had arrived outside Rambo's apartment building in a yellow taxi. Pulling up by the side of the road, she had hastily paid the driver before I could reach for my wallet. "You didn't have to do that," I said, as we climbed out of the back seat. "It's no problem," she replied. I nodded. After a brief assessment of the surroundings, I noticed that Rambo's police truck was parked at the far end of the building, with the vehicle's rear end pointed out towards the main street. The apartment building had the glow and modern aesthetic of a recently built structure. It was made up of 6 separate floors, a number of apartments facing the street on each one. The flats on each floor shared a common walkway stretching from one end of the building to the other. Lagos City's colourful nightlife was in full effect. A number of fried yam, grilled fish and suya meat stands could be seen outside. There were a bunch of outdoor drinking spots, one of which stood across from the building itself. Several people sat eating and drinking. Afrobeat music filled the humid night's air. The entrance to the building was manned by a middle-aged security guard who sat in front of a security gate. He had a wrapped piece of newspaper in his hand, from which he was eating large pieces of fried yam, sprinkled with a peppery-looking sauce. Bolting to his feet like an army recruit, he bounced the flat of his hand off his forehead. "I salute, sir," he said. Figuring he was fishing for a tip, I stuck both hands into my pockets, felt around for my wallet and discovered it was gone. Fumi glanced in my direction and appeared to recognize I'd come up empty. She rummaged into a handbag and produced a 500 naira note. She handed it to the security guard. He nodded in appreciation. "Thank you, madame." With a broad smile, he swung open the gate. We stepped into the building and headed up a concrete stairway. "Looks like my wallet's gone walkies," I said. "Walkies?" Fumi looked at me, her expression puzzled. "Missing." "Ah, sorry, she said. "You need to be careful in this place." "Bit late for that now." She smiled. "Anyway, don't worry. If there's anything you need, I still have some money left over from what you dashed me." "Thanks." Rambo's floor was the fifth one up. We paused on the landing of the stairwell to make a brief plan of action. "Once you get inside, I'm going to need a signal," I said. "No problem," she replied, flashing a phone at me. "I will send you a text as soon as it's safe. Don't leave it too long." We exchanged numbers as she headed out to an exit door that opened onto a lit walkway. I walked over to the door myself, pulled it back a couple of inches, and trailed her with my eyes. There were 3 flats in the direction she was headed, the last 3 on that particular floor. Rambo's apartment was right at the end. A couple of feet past the officer's front door, a concrete wall partition jutted out from the side of the apartment, a seemingly pointless piece of architecture which stretched halfway across the width of the walkway. The wall boasted a giant rectangular-shaped mirror that I suspected Rambo, with his toxic blend of vanity and what I'd considered self-hatred, had taken the trouble of fixing himself. A police tunic had been aired out to dry on the back of a wooden chair by the edge of the balcony. Fumi rapped on the police officer's door. Sticking his head out from the flat, Rambo gazed down the walkway, causing me to duck back into the stairwell. Seconds later, Fumi was permitted entry. I heard the door shut and peered back into the walkway. Fumi was gone. Pulling out my phone, I waited for her message. A minute later, a notification. I had one message. I accessed it, and a single word popped up on the screen in bold letters. "Now!" I darted over to the flat, turned the door handle, and pushed it open. Slow and steady at first. Then I heard Fumi scream and charged in without a second's thought. I heard the shot before I saw the barrel of the gun. A deafening explosion, followed by a tremendous thump to my sternum, which propelled me back into the walkway. I crashed into the edge of the balcony and dragged myself to the side of Rambo's door, stunned but still lucid. Instinctively, I ran my fingers across my chest area. There was a bullet hole in my shirt and a 44mm dent in the ballistic plate of the vest. The pain in my back from colliding into the balcony wall was excruciating. I felt as though I'd been bludgeoned by a sledgehammer, but this was no time for self-pity. Like a 100-meter sprinter, I propped myself up on one knee and lay in wait. The music from across the building shut off dramatically. Yells and screams, confusion and panic. People taking flight on the ground below, and then the lights went out. Literally, a total blackout courtesy of the terminally unreliable National Electric Power Authority. Waiting in silence. The darkness was an immediate asset, a trusted friend, helping to render me practically invisible. I heard footsteps approaching. Quiet footsteps. The sound of Rambo breathing deeply, the shallow and labored breathing of a man consumed by the fear of what he was about to confront on the other side of the door. Then the electric company, notorious for its bad timing, snaps the power back on and the corridor lit up. Turning to my right, I gazed up and saw a portly looking man in his 50s, the man whose breathing I'd been listening to. Dressed in a vest, pajama bottoms and a pair of flip-flops, it was clear he was another resident, probably the neighbor next door. As I looked at him, he stared back at me in disbelief. Silently but furiously, I batted my hand sideways, motioning for him to return to his flat. It was a gesture he either misunderstood or simply didn't care for. He opened his mouth, a look of terror on his face. Then he screamed, "Thief!" A number of things happened in quick succession. Rambo whipped around the door and leveled the gun at me for a second time. I was ready and sprung at him like a cheetah to an antelope. Catching him from beneath the waist, we both went sailing through the air and crashed into the custom-built mirror. Another bullet exploded from the pistol. The feel of a warm, wet liquid hit the nape of my neck. The mirror shattered into a million pieces and we hit the deck. The gun flew from Rambo's grip and skated across the floor of the walkway. Something massive slumped to the ground, the ominous sound echoing behind me. Rambo grabbed me in a front headlock, crushing my neck with 25-inch arms, which seemed to possess the power of a gorilla. The immediate disruption of blood circulation to my brain meant I had just 3 minutes to break free before losing consciousness. With zero experience in this form of combat, I was swimming upstream. And then I felt Rambo dragging me across the floor, dragging and turning me in a clockwise direction. Digging my knees into the floor in an attempt to resist, I found no traction on its surface. The floor appeared to be covered in the same warm, sticky liquid I had felt 30 seconds earlier. Rambo turned me full circle, and I was confronted with the source and nature of the substance. It was blood, a massive pool of it, a giant pool of blood that had spread across the floor and was seeping from a gaping bullet hole in the forehead of Rambo's middle-aged neighbor. He had been struck by the second shot. Gazing at me with a pair of lifeless eyes, he was laid out on the floor. Looking past his dead body, I spotted Rambo's service revolver. The gun was inches from the officer's reach, which explained why he was so determined to get me across the floor. "I will kill you," he screamed, breathing heavily. He dragged on my neck, edging closer to the discarded weapon. "I will kill you." As my eyes dimmed and consciousness began to fade, I committed to the first of two decisions that would bring the dramatic encounter to an explosive finish. Gripping Rambo firmly by the belt of his trousers with my left hand, I hooked my right arm around his right leg and decided it was all or nothing. Rise to my feet or risk dying on my knees. Using every muscle fiber in my anatomy, I pushed off the ball of my foot and heaved myself upwards. Rambo's response was instantaneous. Upping the ante, he doubled the pressure around my neck and pushed downward, determined to thwart my efforts. He was, without question, a strong, powerful man, but so was I. Slowly but surely, I lifted him off the floor. "I will kill you," he screamed again, this time more a statement of panic rather than genuine conviction. His unrelenting grip still crushed my neck like the lockjaws of a pit bull. And then came the next decision, a split-second decision. I glanced at the old chair over which Rambo had spread his tunic and caught a glimpse of his police vehicle parked on the ground below. With Rambo still clinging to my neck, I dashed towards the chair. Confused about where I was headed, Rambo's head snapped around, a look of horror on his face when he realized what I was about to do. Using the seat of the chair as a springboard, I stamped on it and vaulted off the edge of the balcony, a giant leap into space. The chair's legs splintered beneath the combined weight of at least 450 pounds. But we were already airborne, a couple of feet over the edge of the balcony, the only direction to travel, straight down. Rambo screamed and, facing what he knew to be imminent death, released my neck in a desperate attempt to break free. It was a smart decision, one he should have considered earlier. With his leg still locked into the hook of my arm and the belt of his trousers tight in the grip of my fist, there was nowhere to go. We plummeted to earth like a defective rocket. Releasing his leg, I shoved my forearm up under his chin and shoved back his head to ensure I had him lined up for impact. Descending the 5 floors at warp speed, I used his body as a protective cushion. We crashed on the windscreen of his parked truck. The airbag exploded as the back of Rambo's head caved through the glass. Then the vehicle came alive. Like a rebellious, malfunctioning computer, its siren responded with a loud, persistent wail, the hazard lights flashing furiously in the dark. It was clear from the river of blood leaking from every available orifice and the twisted look of terror on Rambo's face that Elvis had left the building. I pushed myself off his damaged, lifeless body and onto the bonnet, but my problems were far from over. My body was screaming in pain unlike anything I had ever experienced before, as though every bone in my body had been shattered into a million pieces. There was a ringing in my ears from what had to have been a perforated eardrum, a splitting headache which was aggravated by the deafening sounds of the car's siren. I found myself beginning to lose consciousness, like a patient experiencing the early sensations of an anesthetic before surgery. That's when I heard her voice and felt her arms around me. "Jonah!" I looked up. In the dark, a hazy picture of Fumi. "Jonah, help me!" she pleaded. I stared at her, confused for a moment as she struggled to pull me up. And then it clicked. She needed my help to get my 250 pounds off the ground. Pushing myself off the ground with the flat of my palm, I gritted my teeth in agony as a tremendous surge of pain shot up my right arm. I was suddenly on my feet, leaning against Fumi like an injured soldier in the heat of battle. She walked me away from the car, and hobbling into the distance, I heard voices in my wake. Several different voices. "Rambo is dead. Them don't kill Rambo. Every day for the thief. Serves him right. Bastard." A crowd was beginning to gather around the truck and the man they'd all despised. It was game over. Chapter 37. Jonah. Dreams of England. Have you been in an accident? I was back at Murtala Mohammed Airport for a flight back to the United Kingdom. The uniformed check-in desk employee stared at me in horror. Considering I had a bandaged eye, stitched bottom lip, and an arm stuck in a sling, his reaction came as no surprise. "Something like that," I responded. He nodded, snapped a label on my travel bag, pushed it through a conveyor belt shuttle, and handed me back my passport and a boarding pass. "You need to be careful," he said. "This is Lagos." Wise words, I thought. Following the death of Rambo, I had been on the phone to Michael, who was still in Abuja with Shade. I was speaking from a hospital bed when he advised I'd get fixed up and hop on the next plane out. We didn't talk about Rambo. Didn't have to. The man was dead, and my silence was evidence of that. The moment I'd left Abuja City, the only person who didn't know he was living on borrowed time was Rambo himself. After momentous crash to earth from over 50 feet, Fumi had taken me to a local medical facility to get patched up. I didn't remember the drive, but woke up several hours later with an intravenous morphine drip stuck in my arm and Fumi seated by my bedside. "You passed out in a taxi," she said after I opened my eyes. "But the doctor said you're going to be okay." I nodded. "Thanks." The door swung open and the doctor walked in. He smiled when he saw me. "Awake at last." He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling, my friend?" "Could be worse." "You know you are lucky to be alive." He motioned to Fumi. "If it were not for this young lady, you would have probably been left to die." He gave me a gentle pat on the arm. "You have to be very careful when you are working on high roofs in this country. You know we don't have the same safety equipment you people use abroad." I glanced at Fumi. She responded with a tiny smile. Do-it-yourself handyman, I thought. Far better than admitting to killing a police officer in a calculated leap of faith. "Favor for a friend," I said. "Well, maybe that friend should consider coming to visit you before you are discharged." He rose to his feet. "Anyway, get some rest. We will discuss your condition later." He exited the room and I looked at Fumi. "Thank you," I said. We stared at each other for a moment. She had an expectant look on her face. Maybe she wanted a hug, a kiss, maybe more. But I'd never been the sentimental sort. And at age 36, there was little chance of that changing. Today she had accompanied me to the airport. I joined her as soon as I had checked in. "All done?" I said. "Good," she replied. Then I heard a familiar sounding voice. "Is that so?" I whipped around. Mr. Taffy was standing behind me. "So you were just going to leave without informing me?" "How did you find me?" I said. Mr. Taffy smiled. "This is Lagos," he replied in a humorous tone. He paused for a spell. "I spoke to Michael. He told me everything." "Then I won't bore you with the details." He nodded. "You did the right thing." He offered his hand. "Your father would have been proud." I shook his hand and smiled. "I got a flight to catch." "Go well." I headed over to the departure gate with Fumi. "Guess this is where we part ways," I said. She flung her arms around me and kissed me on the mouth, her eyes turning moist. "I love you, Jonah." I gazed at her for a spell. She was young and probably didn't even know what love meant. Then again, I wasn't exactly an expert myself. A couple of hours later, I was seated at the window seat of a British Airways 747. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, I quietly watched as the streets, homes and traffic below shrunk to the size of miniature models on a Monopoly board. Seated across the aisle, a Caucasian man gazed in my direction. He smiled nervously. "You all right?" he said. I smiled back at him. "Brilliant," I said. Gazing back down at the disappearing city of Lagos one last time, I shut my eyes and dreamt of England. Epilogue. The Man in the White Hat. The man in the white hat stood with his eyes fixed on the corpse of the 6'9", 350-pound giant. It lay before him like a lifeless, conquered ogre. All in white, save for a pair of black gloves, his white hat was matched with a white safari suit and a pair of white moccasins. To complete his outfit, the man carried a white walking stick in his right hand. Staring at what was now another wasted investment, he allowed his gaze to drift across the smashed coffee table. He observed the scattered heap of £50 notes that he had paid Juku for the giant's services. Any sign of Mr. Juku? He asked his driver, who had come to join him. Dressed in a grey tunic and wearing a chauffeur's cap, the Irishman, known as Mr. Stanley, cleared his throat. Yes, sir. Unfortunately, he is dead. It appears someone pushed him down a flight of stairs. The man in the white hat acknowledged this news with an indifferent nod. Noticing a black wallet lying beneath a scattering of broken glass, he pointed with his stick. Mr. Stanley stepped across and picked up the wallet. He folded it open, extracted a photo ID, and extended it to his employer. The man in the white hat looked at the ID but did not touch it. It was a driver's license. The man in the photograph was the same person he had seen the previous evening. A big man who appeared to be confident in his stride and satisfied with his own company. The same man he believed to be responsible for destroying one of the most destructive fighters he had ever known, until now. Jonah Badmus, he said, reading the name on the card aloud. He looked at Mr. Stanley. Make sure he is found and his name is added to the top of the list. Mr. Stanley nodded. And the money, sir? The man in the white hat did not reply and walked away, but his silence told Mr. Stanley precisely what he wanted to hear. The money was his, or at least as much as he could gather before his employer reached the 4-decade-old German machine parked outside. Grabbing and stuffing as much cash into his pockets as possible, Mr. Stanley estimated that he had about 2 minutes before his employer reached the vehicle, meaning he had to be there in 1. He made it in 50 seconds. Opening the rear door, Mr. Stanley waited patiently as the man in the white hat climbed into the car and settled into the comfort of the back seat. Closing the door behind his employer, Mr. Stanley slipped behind the wheel, fired up the engine, and took a final look at the face of Jonah Badmus, the man chosen as the new addition to the squared circle. Jonah will return in Squared Circle. Thanks for listening.